Hi, everyone. I'm just going to wait another minute or so to let folks come in and get settled. Thanks. All right, it's about 1 minute past the hour, so I'm going to kick off. Hello from sunny London, a rare but welcome event here in the UK, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us for today's IGC event, asking the question, how can we create an enabling environment for solar mini-grids in fragile contexts? I'm Kevin Johnstone, a senior researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED, and I'll be facilitating today's discussion, and it's a pleasure to be with you here. Before we get started, I've got a couple of housekeeping items. One is we are recording today's session, and that will be made available on the IGC's website. All attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. Bassem and Robert will be live interpreting in Arabic and Portuguese, thanks to them both. We'll have time at the end of the panel discussion to answer questions, so please do type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and please do share your name and affiliation. And finally, there is a brief survey immediately following today's event, so please take a minute to fill that out, and your feedback is very important to us in shaping future events. Great. So in order to facilitate the discussion today, I'd just like to start off by setting the context for electricity access globally. As many of us know, there is an enormous deficit, yet it's critical for socioeconomic development. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, estimates that 746 million people worldwide lacked electricity access in 2023, and most living in contexts experiencing conflict and fragility. Solar mini-grids have a huge role to play in communities without access, particularly where the national grid is too expensive to extend. And just to define mini-grids, we're talking about small electricity systems that serve clusters of houses and businesses in a community or town, which are often unconnected to the national grid. According to the World Bank, there's about 19,000 of them, serving 47 million people at the moment, with about 2,500 using renewable energy. And it's a decent start, but we really need to dramatically accelerate deployments. In a scenario which I should mention is unattainable at current trajectories, but I'm mentioning anyway, when everyone achieves access by 2030, the IEA estimates that 30% of people will do it through mini-grids. Another important note is the World Bank has shown that 7 countries, including Bangladesh, Cambodia, Kenya, Myanmar, Nepal, Rwanda, and Tanzania, have achieved some of the fastest gains in electrification in the last decade by integrating traditional grid with mini-grids and solar home systems. So it's quite clear the potential that mini-grids have. But scaling them up in fragile and conflict settings is quite challenging. Successful deployment requires comprehensive planning around demand and supply constraints and innovations in business models, among other strategies. The affordability gap is enormous. Many households and businesses struggle to pay connection fees and higher tariffs. One key element for building demand is integrating so-called productive uses of energy, and this is where people use electricity to increase their productivity and income, and this can at least help in part bridge the affordability gap. On supply of electricity, mini-grids need a supportive legal and regulatory framework to facilitate community engagement and project approval, spur investments, and many other issues. For example, what happens when the main grid finally arrives where a mini-grid exists? Frameworks can help give assurances and reduce these risks. Today, we'll explore these and other key elements, striving for the scale up of mini-grids towards the, I think it's 180,000 or so that the World Bank estimates is needed to connect 440 million additional people in the next couple of years, a tall order indeed. This webinar is part of a work stream of the IGC's State Fragility Initiative, focused on scaling up investments in solar mini-grids in fragile contexts, and this work is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Great. So I've tried to set the stage a bit, and now I'd like to welcome and introduce our specialists. I'm really looking forward to learning from their experiences. First, we have Irene Calvé-Saboritz, who leads the Secretariat of the Mini-Grid Partnership at Sustainable Energy for All. She was previously the CEO and co-founder of Sonkofa Energy, a mini-grid startup focusing on development and operations with projects in Benin, Zambia, and Mozambique. Most welcome, Irene. Next, we have Aaron Leopold, who is the CEO of Energrow, which helps low-income communities in Africa purchase productive appliances to grow sustainable rural electricity demand. Great to have you here, Aaron. Thanks for coming. Finally, we have Onyinye Anine Zulu, who is the head of mini-grids at NG Energy Access Nigeria. It's a mouthful. Leading pay-go provider, pay-as-you-go mini-grid solutions provider in Nigeria. Thanks very much for joining us, Onyinye. Great to have you here. So the structure of today's webinar, we'll be hearing from each of our specialists for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up and offer the audience a chance to ask your own questions as well. Great. I'd like to start with Irene, who has many years working to deploy mini-grids across different contexts and leads the Secretariat of the Mini-Grid Partnership at Sustainable Energy for All. Irene, could you just start off by talking a bit about your work with SE for All?
Hi, Kevin. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for the invitation for this panel. So just maybe to put it very briefly, I've been working as a developer of mini-grids for the past almost 10 years. And now since some time, I joined C4All. So we are leading the Secretariat of the Mini-Grid Partnership. And what the Mini-Grid Partnership is trying to do is really to address the main problems and barriers we are seeing today into the mini-grid space from all the stakeholders' point of view. So instead of, for example, AMDA being the voice of the developers or other agencies, we are really trying to convey with the whole sector. So one of the things we are focusing right now is really on start talking about the way we are deploying mini-grids and in general electrification, and how this is not leading to achieving SDG 7 by 2030, at least in the African continent, and what could be alternatives to that.
Excellent. Thanks, Irene. So given your decade or so working with mini-grids, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about some of the key electricity demand and supplying electricity challenges that you faced deploying mini-grids in fragile and conflict-affected settings.
Of course, Kevin. So what I think would be important is because we already have this discussion, so I'm really trying to frame the context of the fragile states. The problem is what is within the definition of fragile states can be very different case scenarios for mini-grids deployment. And let me provide you with some examples. For example, it's not the same. Let's go, for example, to Mozambique, to give you one country. It's not the same to deploy mini-grids 2 years ago in the north, in the Cabo Delgado situation, where we had terrorism problems, than, for example, in the Tet region, when there is no problem. So that's completely different. It's not also the same to, for example, try to deploy mini-grids in Mozambique, which is a fragile state, whatever the two examples I gave, than in Yemen or even in Ukraine. So that's one of the difficulties we find when we talk about fragile states for energy access, that I think is quite important to try to separate and to do like user case. Because yes, every situation is unique, but given the specific characteristics targeting electricity, I think it would be extremely useful to define like 3 scenarios, 2 scenarios that allow you to really provide with solutions. To give you again an example, it's not the same to deploy electricity in, again, Benin or Nigeria, that in a state that is being bombed all the time. I mean, that changes the whole picture when we are talking about reliability. One of the questions we were debating and we were asking ourselves, depending on the level of fragility, again, if I'm in the middle of a war in Ukraine, I'm not going to make sure that the standards of the network that we use in the European Union is the most of pressing question at that moment. It's really to deploy electricity so people have some hours of electricity per day. So that is really complicated question to answer, but I will try still to give some ideas. So one of the things that I think is important is to decide what is the best technology given the context. Because for building a mini grid, you still have to put on poles, you still have to put on cables, you still have to transport big infrastructure like cables, poles, and everything, trucks. If we are in a situation in which this is complicated, maybe it's better to go either to a solar home system situation, either to a middle ground alternative like power blocks of 5 kilowatts with some batteries, something easier. And the same goes for everything related to demand, but also to supply, because I'm talking about the supply, but for demand, the main problems you find on demand is the revenue of a company that will be installing this electricity solution. So what we see today is that we are having difficulties attracting private capital, even in situations that are less fragile. Let's put it in that way. So one of the things we need to make sure if we want to attract private capital is that the cost of service is fully fulfilled, is fully covered. And for that, maybe one solution would be that this private capital is not exposed directly to demand risk. So if there are problems with the demand, because of course there will be problems with the demand, we are talking about fragile context. So how do we do to make sure that the private capital is not at least fully exposed to that risk and the level of exposure is rather low? We have tried to do that in the past. We have tried to do that via subsidies on CapEx. We have tried to do several de-risking strategies, but still I think we need to go a long way because for the moment, this private equity market is not materializing. So that's exactly what we are trying to do at C4All and the MGP to really looking at alternatives for the regions in which, because again, there might be different examples, but there exist examples for which the level of the risking we apply today is not enough to attract private capital. So what do we do there? And that is covering the cost of service. There are a different bunch of ways to do that. And for every occasion, we need to pick the good one. But I think that it is key, especially on very fragile states, to be able to remunerate the cost of service or even the cost of CapEx without the exposure of the private capital to the demand.
Thanks, Irene. Really interesting answer there. And I think an important question around defining the context and fragility is really important, and a reminder on how different contexts can be and the difficulties in fragile settings. Thanks very much. A second question for you. In your view, what are some of the most essential components of regulatory frameworks in some of these settings that you've described in your previous question?
Yes, so on that, what I think is important again is within the potential differentiations we can find in fragile context. Until now, we have gone through a very light-handed regulation. And I think that's really good for certain examples. But for other examples, maybe what we need is a more heavy regulation on the sense, and I want to make this very clear, not to burden the development of mini grids, not to burden the inclusion of the private sector, but to be able to protect through regulation the benefits and the benefits of the private capital. So how to do that via regulation? And that is the question of maybe concessions, but concession is only an instrument. That's not but I'm using that word because for a lot of people, that means also the regulations that goes into the concession. So you can have, and I think one thing we might be lacking in the case of the African continent is to build on the lessons learned from the past. We've been electrifying countries as a humanity for more than 100 years. All these situations have happened already. Nothing is new, nothing. So what can we learn from the past? When can we apply it for the past? There has been already fragile situations. And let's be honest, most of the grids have been built by public, but there has been also an intervention of the private. How does house work? What kind of collateral can you put? How that is the right questions we need to ask ourselves from my point of view.
Really interesting consideration. Quickly, I'm wondering, from your perception, why have we failed to build on past lessons? There's so much richness of knowledge out there. Why haven't we been able to?
Yeah, I will answer on that, even if my answer might not be as kind as my personal feeling is that the move towards off-grid in Africa, I'm not talking about the specific case of Africa, was more incentivized by the decrease of the PV panel and the cost and the mobile money. So given that, I think we thought it was something new because off-grid was something new, but it wasn't. And we mix a new technology with a new concept, and those two have to be separated. Yes, PV panels in a rooftop way was rather new, but the idea of having islands is not new. And just two examples, like the island in Greece, where I am right now, that is an off-grid by definition. Or another example, how was the grid originally created? Originally, grids, electricity was brought to the factories to produce stuff. And then the people in the cities, because the factories were in the cities, living nearby, got some public-private funding to expand to those, to the city people. And then the different cities at some point got interconnected one with the others. And that's how the grid was built. So it looks like a lot to what we are doing. But we forgot about that and we thought, oh, it's a new technology, so I'm going to invent new stuff. And instead of following the path of the electrification in the past, we have more follow a path of, let's say more Silicon Valley style. I'm going to do startups, I'm going to blah, blah. And sadly, I think electricity is too important in a country, too complex technically, to really leave it to only a service. Partially it can work in some occasions, but the whole planning, the whole importance of the electricity price within a country and its sovereignty, we need to go back to this idea of how electrification has worked in the past.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Irene. Really interesting comments. And at the end, I think you're alluding to energy as an enabler within different contexts. That's really great.
Yeah.
Thanks for your insights. I'd love to jump to Erin next. Erin has 15 years of progressive leadership experience in the renewable energy space and is the CEO of Energrow. Most welcome, Erin, and I'd love if you could also start just a minute about your work with Energrow.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin, and thanks, Anna, for your insightful comments as well. I've been working as you mentioned, Kevin, for about 15 years on renewables in Africa in particular, and one of the major elements of my career has been looking at the economics of bringing energy to extremely poor areas and trying to make the economics work. And for about the past 10 years, I've been really focused on this idea of productive uses of energy, right? So the basic problem with bringing any sort of service into rural areas or fragile areas is that the economics are always uncertain. And if you're making a long-term investment, like a mini grid or a road or a bridge, where there's massive economic uncertainty, you're either not going to do it or you're going to require massive amounts of subsidy to do it, right? And what we see now is both, right? We see half of Africa without electricity, and we see the other half with massively subsidized infrastructure, because we're putting very expensive things into very poor locations, right? And Energrow, very simply, is a microfinance company that offers income generating tools and appliances to electrified communities. So we partner with power companies in Uganda, where we're based and where I am now. We partner with the national power utility, and we partner with all of the major mini grid companies to provide tools and appliances that use electricity, that increase the revenue of the power company, but that also help people in the communities earn more money. So we sell refrigerators and carpentry equipment and welding machines and uh, agricultural processing equipment and cooking equipment. And all of these things are benefiting the community. And the usage of these things is benefiting the economics of the power system. And the idea of Energrow as a company is to improve the economics of rural electrification and to improve the economics of bringing power to unelectrified areas in general. And the biggest real barrier to dramatic expansion of the grid is this lack of certainty around revenues. So, we would not need as much subsidy. We would not need as many guarantees or anything if we had more certainty around how much people would consume. And Energrow is trying to solve that problem. And at the moment, we're one of very few companies that are working on this. In fact, I think we're the only company in Africa whose business model is specifically dedicated to improving the economics of electrification. There are many companies that are doing productive uses, but their target is a bit different. And ours is trying to make the economics work for rural electrification for the first time. So that was more than 1 minute. I apologize, but I feel like that context was important for the rest of.
Amazing. Yes. Thanks so much, Aaron. Some really great points in there. So as you mentioned, affordability is key constraint around bringing electricity. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about flexible payment plans, lease to own arrangements, seasonal or in-kind payments. Some of these have been proven to be effective. So based on your experience, would love to hear a bit more about that.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the big challenges is that there's a lot of mini grid companies, for example, that are trying to bring productive uses onto their grids, but there's legal and just complexity challenges there. So most mini grid companies end up just selling tools and equipment for normal retail prices, and this is for a couple of reasons. One is that you have to be legally registered as a microfinance company in order to offer financing terms, right? Because if if I'm giving you a loan, that means I'm a lender, and lending is regulated, right? So mini grid companies, they are, however, registered as energy companies, and they are also regulated by the energy ministry. So if you're going to have any kind of flexible payment terms on and offered by an energy service provider, it requires them to register a second business under the finance regulator rather than under the energy regulator. So offering any kind of terms increases the complexity quite a lot. And there's some flexibility around that in some countries, but normally you're either a lender or you're an energy company, and generally you're not both. So I just want to put that out there that before anyone tries this at home, make sure you're not breaking any rules when you're doing so, right? But then to very directly answer your question, Energrow, we only offer microfinance products because in general, affordability is the single largest barrier to anyone accessing income generating tools and appliances. We have not actually had to do any sort of tricky, innovative sort of structures with our microfinance, and is work very flexibly with our customers to understand what their circumstances are and to build upfront payment structures that work for them rather than being flexible within the contract period, which is generally a year. So our average loan size is around $300 US, and our average payback period is about a year. We are starting now to do group lending, which is going to significantly de-risk our larger assets, and will offer the flexibility within the group to provide kind of positive peer pressure and peer support in the case of seasonal incomes, of illness, or other kind of challenges where, if one member cannot pay, then another member comes in and supports them. But I would say that, the issue of flexibility in payment terms is an extremely big issue for almost everyone in the microfinance space, because on the one hand, everyone like me wants to do it, but on the other hand, Energrow as a company, we are borrowing money also. We are just borrowing money from a bigger institution, and then we're using that money to lend out to our customers, but we have to pay the bank. And the bank doesn't want to be paid in, maize flour. So if we are taking payments in kind, we still have to go sell that somewhere so that we can pay in cash to our bank. And so what we prefer is rather that our customers, if they are working with in very unstable or informal environments, that we rather work with them by we provide accounting and micro entrepreneurship training to all of our customers. And this helps reduce the need for creative or alternative payment terms, actually. So by building the capacity of our customers to better understand how to run their business and how to work within a loan agreement, we've actually been able to avoid the need for having a diversity of different contracts with our customers, because having that diversity also increases the risk for us. If we have 6 different types of agreements with our customers, it increases or it decreases the predictability of payment, and it increases the complexity of our work. And so we try to avoid that.
Thanks, Aaron. Really interesting context and insights there. When you have these upfront conversations with your customers, I'm wondering if they look different for different folks. For example, thinking about gender, are these conversations different between men and women, thinking about different needs and preferences and access to resources and these kinds of things?
Yeah, so we had a lot of really fascinating learnings around gender. I'll just highlight one now, and then we can come back to it. One main one, and then we can come back to it if it's helpful. So we have to, of course, understand our customer. So any lender does what's called KYC, know your customer, which a lot of companies do. But our KYC is all about trust, believability, and risk, right? And the gender element comes in when you're thinking about, okay, well, we want to lend to this woman who's running a business, or if it's at home, she's cooking for her children, so she's a domestic customer. Who is in control of the money in that business and in that household is not necessarily the person who you are talking to, right? So when you are trying to do a risk profile of a kiosk shop that's selling Coca-Cola and crisps and whatever, you're dealing with a female shop owner, but at the end of the day, she may not be in control of decision making in her business. She may not be in control of the finances of her business. She may not even be in control of what kind of things the business is selling. And she may not, at the end of the day, be in control of the asset that you are selling to that person, right? And so we've had to do a lot of investigation and creative sort of KYC and risk assessments around, for us, making sure that we're really helping the person that we think we are helping, instead of perhaps helping someone else who we are never really in contact with. So on the one hand, this is like a very business-oriented concern, but it's also a huge concern for the individual as well. So when we are working with someone to make sure that they are really in control of their finances and to understand how that can affect our business transaction, we're also trying to understand how how vulnerable is this person, how secure is this person, how can we help make this person more secure and less vulnerable by crafting a loan agreement with her that will allow her to keep control of the asset and of her business, or maybe gain more control of the asset or the business than before. So what we have sometimes done is we have met with the husband and the wife in the case of a married couple, and we have to sit down with both of them and provide training to both of them that this asset is for this business and this business is being run by this woman, and therefore in the Energrow business relationship, she's the boss, and we don't talk about it in like that direct terms because that can be complicated, but we talk about how it's extremely important to have an empowered and in control customer, and try to create a new opportunity for the woman in this case to have more autonomy, more flexibility, more freedom, more decision-making capacity, and at the end of the day, more control over the money that is coming in from the business. And we've not been able to do like longer term impact studies, unfortunately. But this is one of the major areas where we've had to really work with like a gendered lens on lending. Now, there's a whole lot of other gendered elements, but when we're talking about making productive uses work, this is a huge constraint, actually, is the fact that you don't necessarily have the person in front of you who you think is your customer. And I think that this is just like one of 1,000 different gendered elements, but as you can see, it's quite complex, even though it's just a small example. So I'll leave it at that. And if we want to come back to other examples, I'll be.
Excellent. Really interesting stuff. Thanks so much, Aaron. I want to move quickly on to Onyinye. She is heading mini-grids at NG Energy Access in Nigeria, lots of G's in there, and has over a decade of experience in energy management. Onyinye, again, would love for just about a minute to tell us a bit about your work.
Yes, thank you very much, Kelvin, and thank you to the organizers of this program for putting this together. And shout out to all the panelists for all the immense contributions that we have made so far. So I'd just be, I think they've actually pretty much answered most of the questions that we may have to discuss. But however, NG Energy Access, we are a leading mini-grid and solar home system provider, operational in 9 African countries across East, West, South Africa. We run mini-grids across 5 countries and solar home systems across the 9 countries that we do business. So our business is majorly around unserved, underserved, grid deficient communities, and trying to power their lives and ensure productivity. We have our range of products is from as little as a 10-watt bulb to a mid-range product of a 1 kilowatt system, 3 kilowatt system, 8 kilowatt system, and the top range, the largest size of our mini grid so far is about 600 kilowatts. So we're able to connect 1 customer, we're able to connect 1 community, we're able to meet the need of 1 miller, we're able to meet the need of 1 school. And so we fully operate in that space. Specifically in Nigeria, we have over 100,000 customers, mini grids and SHS systems. On the mini-grid side, we successfully entered a partnership with Cross-Boundary Energy Access, where we signed the largest project finance deal for mini-grids in Africa, $60 million to electrify 150,000 people across Nigeria in the next 5 years. So my work essentially is, managing the entire mini-grid space, from the pipeline building to the commercial agreements to the financing, design and construction, operations, and essentially the sustainability of the mini grid business for energy access in Nigeria. Yeah, so that's the interesting work I do.
Excellent. Sounds really interesting and quite a scale that you're working at as well. I'm sure there's huge impacts that we can get into in a little bit. So as many people know, Nigeria has emerged as a leader in mini-grid frameworks. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about your experience with kind of regulatory environment within Nigeria and how that has affected your work with mini-grids.
Yes, so thank you very much for that question. The Nigerian mini-grid framework, I mean, I think it's quite mature. Of course, nothing is perfect, and we can always keep improving, but I think has
I think we may have lost Onyinye. Are you there?
you know, this was part of the review, and I'm just highlighting that to say that
Oh, it looks like we just lost her. Hopefully she'll be able to join once again. Just going to pause 1 minute. Oh, there she is. Onyinye, can you hear us? All right. I'm just going to wait a couple of seconds in the hope that she rejoins us. And if not, I might move us along. Onyinye, can you hear us? No, she's gone. Okay. We'll come back to her if she's able to join again. Would love to open it up to some more questions for Aaron and Irene as well, until Onyinye comes back, and then we can get into some other questions. So there's a question around success and what is success and how do we measure it? Maybe if I can hand
Kevin, sorry,
oh.
do you know, I would have like one small comment on the regulatory regimes, if that could be helpful.
Yeah, sure.
So one thing,
Kevin, can you
when
hear
we're
me?
talking,
Oh, yes, sorry, Onyinye, can you hear us now? Oh no.
Can you hear me now?
I can, but it sounds delayed. Maybe you can try back on the regulatory question, if possible.
Yeah, is it clear? I can go on. I can go on
Yes.
with the question.
Please go
I
ahead.
just turned off my video just so that we can manage the bandwidth. Yeah, so so I was saying that the regulatory framework in Nigeria is a bit robust. We find that the regulation covers site selection, which is pipeline building, even gives us templates of agreements, the exclusivity agreements, commercial agreements, even land lease, and allows developers. So in Nigeria, the regulatory framework allows the developers to select sites, of course, certain boundaries. In other countries, you find concessions where the government gives you concessions, but for Nigeria, it's an open selection. Of course, defines things around the types of mini grid, their sizes, their capacities, the license types. You know, speaks around M&E, monitoring and evaluation. Actually has a section for commercial agreements, determination of tariffs. We use the multi-year tariff order in Nigeria, and also speaks around grid arrival, compensation if and should the grid arrive at any point in time. You know, clear cut-out processes to follow, you know, has a space for dispute regulation, and even should the mini grid developer wants to transfer the permit to another person, the regulatory framework actually allows for it. So our experience in Nigeria has been pretty good. And I mean, that is even signaled by the kind of investment that's coming to Nigeria. You find out, you know, in places where, you know, you have good regulation, naturally financing follows. good regulation. So I think this has been pretty good for us in Nigeria. It has allowed for, you know, even a competitive market. So right now, you know, developers can go to any community anywhere. I have a conversation with the communities. It's some sort of a willing seller, willing buyer model, where, you know, you speak with the community, you find out if they like you, you know, quote unquote, if the product you're selling is what they can buy, if it's affordable enough for them. So you also find, like in Nigeria, we don't have a uniform tariff. From one mini grid to the next, chances are you find a different tariff, right? So it depends on what you negotiate with the community. And then speaking about tariffs, the MITRE also allows for, you know, some level of cost-effective tariffs. The macroeconomic conditions in Nigeria have significantly changed in the past 12 months. But I think before those 12 months, we could say that our tariffs were very close to cost reflective in the past 12 months, just because of the hyperinflation that we're having and the forex depreciation of our foreign exchange. Most tariffs, you know, may not be at, you know, the level of cost reflectivity, but prior to that, we were very close to that. So the regulation actually, you know, you could say it was in a very open, competitive regulation, and it sought to allow for private sector to come in and drive the market, and so the regulatory framework was set up in that system. And I think it's been helpful. And like I said, the regulator specifically is open to conversations. And, you know, we've given feedback and we've seen an update of the current regulation, allowing, you know, for some of the inputs that the sector players had, you know, highlighted some of the barriers and roadblocks. You know, we've also seen updates to those roadblocks. Do I think we need additional enablers? Of course, enablers are always good. There's no place rural electrification has been done without significant government intervention to make sure that the very vulnerable of the society, you know, have access to energy, and not just the light bulb, but, you know, energy for productivity. So would require a more enabling environment that will allow for, and I think beyond you know, the specific energy space, that just allows for the macroeconomic conditions to be favorable, you know, tax incentives, if there are conversations around demand side subsidies, especially in the very fragile context, because at that point we're looking at, you know, the economic capabilities of the people in those locations may not be the very best. So those are some of the kind of support that we need. I also do think that support around capacity building would be very helpful, so that capacity is localized. You can, if you want an engineer that can develop X number of mini grids, you find it because once more and more of those capacities are available, we find that it's easy to deploy systems quickly to make sure that, so capacity building, not just for engineers, you know, for engineers, for finance people, for lawyers, those kind of technical assistance programs will be super useful to the sector in driving down the cost, you know, the eventual cost of the system to the community. So I'll stop there. I think Aaron wanted to say something. I'm happy to take any more questions.
That's great. Thanks so much, Onyene. Some really interesting points in there around regulation and how private sector can drive the market with the help of a good framework. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about you know, how these things have come about. What's the role of private sector and the public sector and governments when developing these kinds of things? For example, you mentioned that the regulators is quite open to conversations. That sounds quite interesting. What roles have different stakeholders played in developing these good frameworks and regulations?
Yes, thank you very much, Kevin. So I think
Looks like we may have lost her again. Onyene, can you hear us? Just gonna pause a second. maybe while we wait, Aaron, you wanted to mention something on regulatory frameworks. I'm wondering if you want to hop in now.
Sure. Yeah. Before running Energrow, I was the founding CEO of the Africa Mini Grid Developers Association that helped shape the regulatory policies in 12 countries around mini grids. So I can speak a little bit to this. I'll just say two quick things. So the first, what I wanted to mention before is a bit what Irene had also mentioned, that in fragile states. So if we're talking about like, Kano in northern Nigeria as a fragile state, this is one thing. But if you're talking about Somalia and how we're going to rebuild Sudan and really like extremely complicated, long-term, fragile contexts, you don't necessarily want regulation. And this is something that is controversial but shouldn't be. If you look in Somalia, if you look at Myanmar, there are hundreds and hundreds of mini grids in both of those countries. They are both extremely fragile states, and they have all been built by the private sector. There is no functioning government in Somalia to build out energy infrastructure, but there are hundreds of mini grids. There are more mini grids in Somalia than there are in Kenya. And regulation is extremely important when you are trying to bring in long-term, large amounts of capital. But if you are in a protracted, long-term, fragile environment, large capital, large foreign sources of capital will never come into your market. And therefore, you want informal, flexible options for constructing your energy system. And therefore, the more rules you have, the less flexibility you have, and regulations can become a complicator rather than a facilitator, right? And in DRC right now, there are also no regulations, or they're being designed right now. And it's been fine, right? They have been able to attract private sector investment because the companies that are working there are doing so responsibly. They're building things to international standards. And the other thing around regulation is that in some states, regulations are often an opportunity for corruption as well. And so there's been some people that are pushing in DRC to wait on regulations because they don't want corrupt government players coming into that conversation. So regulation is good. I'm not arguing against regulation. We're talking about fragile states where humanity and safety and health are the primary concerns. And regulations are supporting safety and health for sure, but they're not the only tool in the toolbox to help create the conditions for safety and good health. But that being said, I think that was a bit of a side chat, but I wanted to really emphasize like the combination of like regulation and fragile states is not normally a topic that goes together. And so I wanted to just ensure that the audience members really understand that there's sometimes a conflict between them, that they're not always something that is necessary in those complex environments.
Thanks, Aaron. A really interesting and important point in there. Thanks very much for that. I don't see Onyinye on, so I think we're just going to move to some other questions, if that's all right. For either Aaron or Irene, I'd love to hear a bit more about how you define success in your work, types of measurements that you look for. How do you measure it, M&E systems, these kinds of things, feedback loops on learning. Would love to hear a bit more on that. Yes, please, Irene, jump in.
Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So on the question of success, and I'm pretty sure Aaron can build them with more specifics. But I was going to more on the general idea, what does it mean success? Because we've been counting success as connections and as the rate of electricity access. And of course, for C4All, our objective being SDG 7, that's important. But we are also wondering what happens not only with connections, but with reliability. What do we consider as energy access? And that has been a whole discussion on the topic. I mean, not closed yet. And I mean, there are a lot of organizations, most of the organizations of the sector are actually working on that, on what does it mean electricity access. And there are different proposals from the tier system with different tiers depending on the level of access, the idea of a minimum vital, minimum energy vital. I don't remember exactly the acronym, but there has been a lot of discussions, and I really think that it is really important that we agree on that. And not only, I mean, because we are talking now about fragile context, but with climate change and extreme weather events and everything, sadly, this is going to be a more recurrent conversation more and more. So I think this is something quite urgent we need to develop right now. To provide you with examples, in the past week or 2 weeks, I have been reading articles about blackouts in different regions like Canada, Pakistan, like all over the world. Even in my country, in Spain, there are cities in which the most poor neighborhoods, they keep cutting the light in the summer because of the peak of the AC. So what do we call electricity access? And I think one idea could be that it's based on the services, on the, not services, but on the level, on the needs, let's put it that way. And we need to define what universal needs need to be covered. Like, for example, let's imagine you need to not be cold, not be hot, being able to store food, being able to have light. I don't know, I'm missing, and being able to have access to health and to education. Let's put that. That is not going to represent the same in, I don't know, in Benin that in Iceland. For example, in terms of demand related to heat and hot and cold. So I think one of the things we should do is really to translate, to define what are the basic needs we consider for electrification, to define electricity access, and translate that to the reality of every region or country with a number. But we cannot have the same number for the whole world. It doesn't make sense from my point of view. And also, there's a second layer on that. It relies too much on efficiency, and not everyone has the same access to efficient appliances. First of all, because of the price, and we end up in the same feedback loop. Most of the time, the people that use the less efficient appliances is the most poor people. So why these people should be penalized if they don't have money to invest? Another thing would be that the price is the same and then fully fair. But if they don't have the money to invest, like for example, in electrical car, in all these things, we need to start thinking about these things, not only in fragile states, but in general.
Thanks, Irene. Some really great insights there. I'm wondering, is success different in different fragile contexts? Irene, you just mentioned, I think, Benin and Iceland, for example, and you mentioned building on needs. I'm wondering if Erin and Onyinye, you could kind of talk about what success might look like in your different contexts.
I would be happy to give an example, but I've spoken a lot. So Onyinye, maybe you want to jump in. If not, let
Yeah, go for it, Aaron. I'd go after you.
well, I would just build on what Irene has mentioned. So I would say that success means different things to different people. Mini grid companies and Energrow, we want to build things and we want to get services to people. And of course, a lot of players in the international community want that as well. But for investors, success means getting their money back. And my and mini grid companies' intentions and success don't match with the success that is defined by the people that have the real power in the relationship, who are the financiers. So my success, therefore, is defined through their lens of success, right? And I think this creates a lot of problems where we have donors, for instance, who will provide guarantees and other sort of de-risking instruments for investors, but those de-risking instruments are often underutilized or not utilized at all, because investors will, this is a little bit off topic, but not really. Investors are rewarded internally by the success of the investments that they make. So if you have a guarantee facility, for instance, and that guarantee facility is needed because an investment did not go the way that it was supposed to go, it means that the individual people in the investor will be penalized financially. They will not get their bonus, or they will not get the promotion because the investment required the guarantee, and therefore it was a bad investment. No investment should require a guarantee. Otherwise, it's too risky for us, right? And so we have these institutional definitions of success and failure that are far away from the impact that we want to see, but they're preventing the success on the ground that we want to see. So I would say that, of course, for me and for Onyinye and for Irene, success is solving the SDG challenge. But in a way, we are prevented from doing so because there's a lot of incentives that are not lined up with this objective. And the answer is not, like more guarantees. The answer is to be more aware of not like how money works, but like how the institutions that control the money, how they work. And if we had that aligned, we could create better grants, better incentive structures, and then we could get on with our work of creating such.
Excellent. Really interesting, Aaron. Thanks for those inputs. And I see Irene's hand wants to jump in as well. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to subscribe every single word that Aaron has said. I mean, for me now, my life is easier. Not in general, but through this specific question, I have to say that my life is easier because I can finally answer what my goals are, which are the same as Aaron, and I'm sure the ones of Onyinye. But the reality when you're a developer is that your interests, your objectives, your well done, etc., is the one of your investors. And investors, I mean, even if they are impact investor, whatever kind of investor, they want a certain profitability for the money, which makes sense. Otherwise, I would put my money elsewhere. And the same goes for the people working there. They have their own incentives. And for the moment, those incentives are not aligned. And as a developer, developers are in an extremely difficult situation because people expect, and when I say people, I'm talking about DFIs, I'm talking about regulation agencies, etc., that you want to do connections. Of course, you want to do connection, but you serve another God, which is the money you need to do those investments. So that's your primary thing to be served, the capital. And for the moment, that is not, I don't know if it's a problem of understanding or acceptance of how the financial work in which we live right now works. But this is the reality. And sometimes it looks like we are working on wishful thinking and not on the reality. And we need to address these heavy barriers to make our life easier. Otherwise, I mean, it's seriously, the developers are put in a very difficult situation.
Great. Thanks, Irene. Really interesting conversation. I noticed, Aaron, you answered a question, but I just want to throw it out there for discussion as well. Thanks for answering that. Question is following up on Aaron's comment, what other tools beyond regulation are available to ensure safety and minimum levels of quality in fragile settings? And this is an interesting question because it feels a bit of a tension as to what we were talking about before in terms of less regulation is better for some contexts. So quite interested to hear opinions on safety and minimum levels of quality.
My network is still bad, but I hope you can hear me, Kevin.
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Apologies, it's raining here. Yeah, so I think I'll just take a stab at that. I think regulation is the best tool to guarantee the minimum levels of quality and safety is crucial. Whilst I agree that we need more flexibility with the regulations, to allow for a lot of innovation and allow for cost cutting and for, of course, alignment of incentives. I think for safety reasons, we must uphold, whatever regulations that we need for safety reasons. We also have a lot of industry associations. So, for example, I think for some certain items that you have to use on the network, is certified by a certain industry association. So if you're buying this, it's gone through certain certifications. So I think those are also other tools that can be used, but I think I'd still defer to regulation, especially for safety. For quality of service, it can actually be agreed between both parties, right? To say, especially in Nigerian context, if it's a willing buyer, willing seller, to say, hey, this is when I need the power the most, right? Can you guarantee, even if you can't guarantee 24 hours, can you guarantee between this hour and this hour? And both parties, incentives are aligned to the consumer wants power at this time, the most critical time, whatever season it is, if it's for just security reasons, so to have power at night, if it's for economic reasons, to have power when there's, economic activities. I think if you also align the incentives of the buyer and the seller, it's also a good tool to guarantee quality of supply. Of course, with penalties on both sides, if you guarantee a minimum level of service, then you pay X amount of penalty, and that kind of agreement can be arranged between the two parties involved.
Great, thanks, Onyinye. Great example there. Wondering if Aaron or Irene, you want to jump in a bit more on this question of safety and minimum levels of quality, particularly in fragile contexts.
Just very short from my side, I would agree with Irene's statement before around, efficiency and safety are two things that are very, very important, but they add substantial cost. So safety standards, rather. So there's always a balance that is required, right? So if you look at a lot of rural communities now, people don't know what they should be buying if they are accessing productive use appliances, for instance, and they don't know the difference between different solar home systems or other things that are available on the market. And both, GOGLA, the global or the off-grid lighting industries industry association, they really had a lot of issues with cheap knockoff fake products that would not last very long, as low quality but very cheap alternatives. But this is what people could afford, right? And so if you want to have the safety of a Volkswagen, but you can only afford, like a little tiny, I don't know, like an old used Ford or something, and you need to get from A to B, do you want to walk or do you want to take the old car? Right? That's the choice that a lot of fragile states and people in fragile conditions have. And so it's very much the responsibility of industry to provide transparency and clarity around these trade-offs, right? And I would say that, especially around efficiency and not necessarily safety, there's a huge added cost. It doesn't cost a lot to make something safe, but it often does cost a lot to make something efficient. And I think that we in the part of the sector that's really focused on um, the impact side, we want the highest standards at all times, of course, right? But in the meantime, you're preventing some people from accessing the service at all by creating this barrier, right? And so it's just a trade-off that you need to be aware of, and that no one is against any of these standards. What we are against is blindly implementing them without an understanding of the full context.
Thanks, Aaron. Some really great points in there. We've got about 10 minutes, 9 minutes left. We've got another question around cryptocurrency mining and AI. Data centers seem to be gaining some attention as anchor customers of mini grids in some African countries. This may not be workable for more fragile states, but what potential do you see for that more generally? What may be the consequences or unintended consequences otherwise? And then we have one clarifying question from Aaron: consequences of Bitcoin mining or of them not being workable in certain areas. I don't know if Sarah is still on, if she can clarify the question. I don't know if she can actually answer, maybe not. Okay, let's make some assumptions. Let's assume consequences of Bitcoin mining, I suppose, on energy, and then also both of them, I suppose. Yeah, Irene, please go ahead.
I'm a bit confused by the question, or I mean, maybe it's a good example of what I mentioned at the beginning of my, I think, first intervention of the question. I think we went through a weird path for designing electricity access and energy access. We need to go back to the lessons learned and stop with fancy, new, not tested, short-term solutions like cryptocurrency or AI increasing the electricity demand. I don't think, first of all, are we sure that's a good thing? I mean, it's a good thing to ensure profitability of a mini grid, but like, seriously, are we talking about energy in general, about the idea of the amount of energy we are consuming as the humanity, etc.? Because to be honest, when we start to see the level of electricity or energy that cryptocurrency and the energy plus water that artificial intelligence is consuming. And don't get me wrong, because I think the middle ground is the right spot, because I'm also seeing a lot of people like, no, EA is bad because it takes out on jobs. That's not true. It depends on the usage you do for EA. There are uses. The other day I was seeing like how it can detect breast cancer 5 years before. I mean, that's great. But for example, using it maybe for Google searches, maybe that's not the most efficient for the planet. So I think that before going to cryptocurrency mining or EA as the solution for energy access, I think we need to ask ourselves as the humanity, what do we want from those technologies, how to use it, and how to arbitrage between the right usage of technology and the resources we have available in the planet.
Great, thanks, Irene. Back to basics, it sounds like really, really good insight there. Onyinye, Aaron, any thoughts on the consequences of using energy for AI or cryptocurrency mining? Otherwise, I might jump to.
Yeah, I can just say that I mean the examples that I am aware of are specifically when the community is not utilizing enough power, when the batteries are full and when the solar is basically being wasted. This is when the Bitcoin mining is taking place. So it's supposed to be creating an alternative revenue stream and not replacing um, existing use cases. It's often the case, for example, that a solar mini grid during the daytime everyone is out farming in their fields using very little electricity, and then they come home at night and they use power to do all of their activities after the sun sets. But meanwhile, the batteries have been charged for 6 hours, and the solar panels are not really being utilized effectively. So what can the mini grid company do in those circumstances is find ways to earn money where the customer is not necessarily in the community, but you can perform a service like Bitcoin mining that is valuable remotely, and someone elsewhere can be paying for that service.
Yeah, really great point, Aaron, there, especially around the cost of at least solar mini grids at night. Interesting. Great. So we've got about 4 minutes left. It feels like it's about time for closing. I really love this conversation. Lots of interesting points. Maybe we can just kind of cover one main point each. It can be reiterating a point you made before. It could be something new presenting, but one point that you think is really essential to be put into practice as soon as possible to scale up mini grids. It's a tall order, I know, but do give it a go. Happy to start with a volunteer. Or I'll have to call on someone. Okay, I'll call on myself. I'm gonna touch on, maybe I can wrap up and then we can have just a couple final comments. So I was trying to take as many notes as possible, some really great points. We heard about what success means for different people, and particularly for those with the money and those handling the money, and how success is different for those trying to get energy access to folks, and how we can align that better through better incentives. A need to go back to the basics of electricity access and reapply the lessons that we've fought for over the last 100, 120 years in electrification across the world. We heard about regulation can bring competition in certain markets, but in the case of fragile markets, less regulation might be necessary to help those budding markets. And we agreed that efficiency and safety are very important, but it also adds costs. There needs to be a balance in there. One last point I thought was really interesting around gender and different needs and types of people is who is in control of the money in the business of productive uses is not necessarily the person who you are talking to when giving a loan. Super interesting insights there. And I'd just like to hand over to our three panelists to give just kind of one last statement. And I'm going to start with, oh, we've already lost Onyine. That's too bad. Maybe Irene, you could give us your last comment.
I really think that during the whole panel, I've been trying to move to the same idea, which is let's really go to the basics. Let's analyze what has happened in the past 10 years, because we need to exercise the capacity of being critics with ourselves. And we need to understand why we are not close to SDG 7 right now in Africa. And I think that if we don't do that, the rest is excuses. So sometimes it's a difficult situation because we don't know the answer, because the situation is not easy. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. But I don't think it's fair to not stop for a second and think, because today we can say it's facts. I remember 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the market will be there. That's not happening as we expected. It is not, even though there are success cases. So if we are fair and we want to achieve the objective of SDG 7, we need to stop, analyze, and change the path to actually achieve SDG 7. If it's not by 2030, it will be by 2040. That's not the huge oppressing issue. The huge oppressing issue is that continue as it is just running towards a wall. And that doesn't make sense from my point of view.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Irene. Great closing remarks. Aaron.
I would just say, in support of Irene's point, also when I was the CEO of AMDA, the Mini Grid Association, I said all the time that I hate the phrases innovative finance and innovative business models because we already know how to do this. When you say we need more innovative finance and we need more innovative business models, you know what that means? It means wait. It means stop everything. It means nothing is good enough yet. It means we don't know enough. So we should wait. And that while we wait, billions of people are without electricity. All the fragile states are getting more fragile. As Irene said, let's just do what we know how to do and get busy doing it and pay for it the way that we know how to do it today. And those companies that are on the ground building in those fragile states, they will learn and they will innovate. But we cannot ask them to innovate without any money and without any experience. They need to do it in order for us to learn and innovate. And the people in these fragile environments deserve that as well.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Aaron. Great closing remarks. Aaron, Irene, Onyinye, thanks so much for your time today. Great insights. Thanks to our audience for joining. There's going to be a brief survey immediately following today's event, so please do take a minute to fill it out. Thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day, and bye for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much.